section. If you are referring to your book, we're on page 15 in the middle, and we're ready to begin.
That's what actually happened. God raised Jesus from the dead.
Right.
That must have been a little challenging.
What do you mean?
I mean, giving up your ideas about God, especially when what God actually did was so different than what you've been expecting.
I think you're exactly right. In fact, I sort of think we all carry around inside of us a little picture of what we think God is like.
Mine probably looks like a combination of my favorite grandfather and Santa Claus.
I don't think you're alone in that. We all carry these pictures around, and they're usually not pictures of a guy hanging on the cross.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, most of us tend to think about God in terms of what we think God ought to be able to do. You know, God knows everything, so we say God is omniscient. That's Latin for knows all things. Or we figure God is all powerful, so we call God omnipotent.
Let me guess, Latin for all powerful.
Right. We define God in terms of God's attributes, ideas, or theories about what any self respecting God should be able to do. And when God comes and does something so different than what we'd expected, like die on the cross and then rise again.
That messes with our picture of God. I think I see what you mean.
Yeah, it totally messes with our pictures of what God should be. And although that's hard to get over, I mean, who wants to trade in a powerful warrior God for some schlep who gets the death penalty? It ultimately ends up being incredibly helpful.
How so?
Because the God who is omniscient, omnipotent, all holy, we shouldn't forget that one. That one is incredibly hard to approach, nearly impossible, actually.
What do you mean?
Well, the great thing about an all holy, all powerful God is that it feels like you can count on this God, right? I mean, this is what you expect from God.
Right?
The difficulty is that we can never measure up to this kind of God. I mean, how can we expect to understand this kind of God or be understood in return? Further, how can we imagine even standing in the presence of this kind of all holy, all just God when we're so definitely not all holy or all just?
I think I'm following, but could you say a little more?
Let me try to explain by telling a story from history, the Christian church's history in particular.
Fire away.
Okay, there's this guy, a monk actually, named Martin Luther.
The guy so many churches are named after.
He's the one. He lived in the 16th century and took everything people said about God very seriously. And mainly what they were saying about God in the Middle Ages was just what we've been talking about. They said that if you want to know God, you focus on God's attributes. God is all holy, all powerful, all knowing, all just, and so on. And the more Luther thought about that, the more worried he got.
Worried? Why? I thought you said he was a monk.
He was.
So what's he got to worry about? He's given his whole life over to serving God.
Yeah, but that means he's got a whole lot of time to think about God, and mostly he ends up thinking that if God is all holy and all just and knows everything to boot, then God knows that he, Martin Luther, doesn't totally measure up. Because no matter how much Luther may try, and believe me, he tried really, really hard, he still ends up making mistakes. What the church calls sinning. And he figures this can't go down well with an all holy, all just,
all powerful, all knowing God. Got it. If God is all everything, then we don't look so hot. In fact, we're downright rotten in comparison and don't have a chance with this God.
Exactly. Luther ends up feeling that there's this huge chasm between where he is and where this God of attributes is, and it scares him. He just doesn't know how to approach this kind of God, let alone be acceptable.
I get that. It's like a kid trying to live up to his overbearing, overachieving parent, or working for this incredibly demanding perfectionist boss, except multiplied 1,000 times. I mean, where do you even begin? How do you even talk to a God like that?
That's Luther's dilemma in a nutshell. This God of attributes, all knowing, all powerful, all holy, and all the rest, ends up being downright terrifying. Because we can never be sure this God will even want to have anything to do with us, let alone help us in our time of need.
And Luther's solution?
That's where the cross comes in. Luther ends up seeing in Jesus another side of God. Or maybe better, Luther wonders if he'd ever really seen God clearly before at all.
You might want to slow down a little.
No problem. From early on, Christians have confessed that Jesus isn't simply another prophet or messenger, but actually is the Son of God, and because of this, represents God fully. In fact, Christians believe Jesus actually is God in the flesh.
Sounds a little complicated.
Believe me, on one level it is. Formally, it's called the doctrine of the incarnation, which means literally in the flesh. And it took the early Christians a couple of centuries to think it all through. At another level, though, it doesn't have to be quite so complicated, as the incarnation is at heart a promise that everything you see in Jesus really is true of God.
Kind of like the WYSIYG on my PC.
WYSIWYG.
Yeah.
Yeah, that confused me. We are human beings reading here. Now, I'm not following, but maybe that's because I use a Mac.
We'll save the Mac PC debate for later. But for now, what you said about what we see in Jesus being true of God reminds me of when I got my first PC, right after Microsoft came out with Windows.
Which was, as I'm sure you'll recall, Microsoft's attempt to be more like Apple.
Whatever. The point is, when Microsoft first developed Windows, they created this little device driver, a program, that made it so that when you saw on the screen was what you got on the page. Before that, when you were writing, italicized words would be one color, bold-faced words another, etc. But nothing looked quite like it was going to look when you printed it out.
How do you know all this?
Like I said, this was my first computer, and I tried to learn everything I could about it. Anyway, they named this program WYSIWYG for What You See is What You Get. And it sounded like that's what the early Christians wanted to say about Jesus through their doctrine of incarnation. What you see in Jesus is what you get in God. So in a sense, Jesus is God's WYSIWYG.
Brilliant, really. I'll have to remember that one.
I'm glad I can help. So, you were saying that Luther came to believe that Jesus shows another side of God, or maybe even that Jesus shows Luther that he had been wrong about God all along.
Right, because what you see in Jesus is what you get in God. I like that. You need to rethink all the talk about God attributes in light of what actually happens to Jesus. And once Luther did that, he realized that the God we see in Jesus is quite different from the God of attributes he'd imagined. Luther says that this God, the one revealed in Jesus on the cross, is vulnerable rather than powerful, approachable rather than distant, and is someone you can count on receiving mercy and grace from rather than judgment. Ultimately, Luther observes, this God is the one who understands everything we go through, because in Jesus, God went through it all too, even death.
Which made it easier for Luther to imagine that this God maybe could accept him, maybe actually love him.
Exactly.
But are you saying, or is Luther saying, that God isn't all holy or all just or all powerful in the rest?
What do you think?
Well, I can see how focusing on all the attributes gets overwhelming. But still, isn't God supposed to be all those things? Isn't that what makes God God?
That's where Luther gets stuck too.
Glad I'm in good company.
Definitely.
So what does he do?
He ends up saying that God is both all powerful and all the rest, and that God is approachable and understanding.
How convenient.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It sounds like a contradiction, but when you think about it, it actually makes some sense.
If you say so, though to be honest, I'm not there yet.
Try this then. Think about the President of the United States.
Okay,
He's regularly called the most powerful man on earth, and I'm guessing that most people are kind of in awe when they meet him, maybe even intimidated.
I think that's how I'd probably feel.
But now think about his kids. To his kids, the president isn't the president, he's just dad. Whatever they think of him, I doubt they're intimidated.
And they're probably not exactly in awe of him either.
Right. And that's kind of what Luther is saying about God. In one sense, God is all powerful, all holy, and all the rest. You said it well. That's what makes God God. But that's not the whole story. That's not even the main story. In Jesus, we also see that God is a God of love, a God who wants to relate to us as a parent instead of as a cosmic president. Luther came to believe that in Jesus we discover a God willing to suffer for our sake, a God who loves us enough to become one of us, to live our life, and to die our death. So, whatever God may be in general, all powerful and all the rest, in the cross, we see God setting all that aside in order to be for us, living for us, caring for us, and eventually dying for us.
Interesting.
It gets even more so as Luther eventually begins to wonder whether all of our ideas about God are kind of mixed up apart from the cross.
What do you mean?
Well, think about what we've said about God's attributes: all holy, all just, and the rest. They make sense because that's what we assume God is like, what God ought to be like. And on one level, it makes sense to talk about God this way because God is the creator and sustainer of the universe. But on another level, the cross reveals that it doesn't make any sense to talk about God in this way, and that maybe we were wrong to assume these things. That is, the cross suggests that maybe we assume divinity is about power, but we discover that it's not. That God is most truly God when God is being caring, vulnerable, and forgiving.
And Luther got all this from looking at the cross?
Right. Like we said, no one expected the cross, not when it happened and not ever since. So the cross reveals a different kind of God than anyone expected, which is good news because, as Luther points out, when you look to the God of attributes, all you see is God's righteousness and justice, and you end up being terrified. You can't find any mercy, grace, or goodness there. It might be there, and you hope in high heaven it's there, but you can't count on it because all you see is God's attributes. But when you look at the cross, you see God revealed as vulnerable, loving, gracious, like a parent willing to do anything to save his or her children. This God, Luther realized, is unrelentingly for us, on our side, always eager to draw near to us in love.
Which is why the cross becomes so important, because it reveals to us this other side of God, or actually, a whole other side, a whole other God than we'd expected.
That's it. Luther calls this way of talking and thinking about God the theology of the cross, because it measures everything we assume about God against what we actually see revealed in the cross. In fact, he was once asked what he thought about when he thought about God. You know, what attribute of God is most important?
And what did he answer?
He skipped the attributes altogether and instead said, "When I think about God, I think of a man hanging on a tree."
What did he mean by that?
That he thought that whenever we say something about God, we should start not with how we think God should be, but instead with what God actually did. That in turn means all our talk about God attributes have to be filtered through a cross-shaped lens. For instance, what do you mean by all powerful when you see Jesus suffer on the cross? What do you mean by all just when Jesus forgives sinners and dies an innocent man? What do you mean by all knowing when Jesus cries out in despair on the cross?
That's beginning to make more and more sense. But I have to say that it also paints a very different picture of God than I'd imagined.
Say a little more.
Well, when I think of God, I don't think first of a guy hanging on a cross. In fact, that's almost the opposite of what I suspect most people think about. Instead, I think of God's power, the one who created the whole world and all of that. But this God seems pretty powerless. Is that what Luther meant by saying that we have to filter talk about God's attributes through the cross?
That's exactly what he meant. His theology of the cross means calling into question our assumptions about God, including how God is powerful.
How God is powerful? What do you mean?
The cross invites, maybe actually demands, that we reconsider what we assumed about God and God's power in light of what God actually did in Jesus. So the question becomes, what does God's power look like when it doesn't come packaged as a mighty king or warrior, but instead is revealed in a guy who gets executed?
So Luther, and lots of other Christians too, I'm assuming, focused on the cross because it told him things he might have missed otherwise.
Right. In fact, one of my favorite movies with lots of cross imagery sums it up pretty well.
What's the movie?
Cool Hand Luke.
I've heard of it. The one with Paul Newman, right? But I haven't seen it.
It's about this guy named Luke, obviously, who doesn't understand life. He comes back from a war and nothing makes sense. So he starts doing stupid things, like cutting the heads off of parking meters.
Why does he do that?
You don't really know, except that in general, the rules of society don't make sense to him. Whether they're big rules, like why you have to go to jail for committing a crime, or little ones, like why you have to pay to park your car. In any event, because of the stuff he's doing, he ends up in jail. And there are a lot of rules in jail too, but they don't make sense to him either. So he breaks them, and he gets punished. And he breaks more and is punished more until he finally tries to escape prison. When he's brought back, the prison warden says, what we've got here is a failure to communicate. And that pretty much sums things up. It's like someone forgot to communicate to Luke something important about life, and so none of it makes sense.
And this connects to the cross how?
I think that's what Luther is trying to say about our life of faith too. Apart from the cross, all we can imagine is the God of attributes. And so God ends up being kind of terrifying, and much of life doesn't make sense. There's this great scene in the movie when a thunderstorm comes up. The other prisoners run to take shelter, but Luke just stays out there and starts yelling up at the thunder and lightning, eventually shouting at the all-powerful God one of the other prisoners is afraid of. Except Luke's not sure this God even exists, so he shouts, "Let me know you're up there. Come on. Love me, hate me, kill me, anything. Just let me know it." Finally, he gives up. The God of attributes either doesn't exist or is just not approachable.
I think I see what you mean. So Luther is saying that we're like Luke. Most of life, definitely God, doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you have a clearer sense of not just what God is, but who God is.
Right. And according to Luther, if much of life feels like a failure to communicate, then the cross is God's way of establishing communication, of telling us more directly what God is up to and just who God really is for us.
Okay, I think I'm with you, more or less, with an emphasis on think.
I know what you mean. It takes a little time for it to sink in, but this is exactly why your questions are such good ones and why the cross is worth talking about, because it's right at the center of the Christian faith, and as we've already seen, not the simplest thing to explain or understand. And we're on page 25, and we're ending there. And that's the end of our second reading. We'll see you on Monday with the last of chapter 1 readings.